Moving on, item 3, council policy, advertising on city property. I'm going to go right to the city attorney on this one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, Patty generally would have been here for this as well, but unfortunately she had a conflict that she had to attend and asked me to basically go forward with this. Just to remind everybody and remind the public where this came from. Initially, at least this election cycle, as you know, it seems like every 4 years, the state of New Hampshire, through the Attorney General's office and the Secretary of State's office, they sort of wake up because there's a presidential election that happens, and we're in that cycle again, and they have woken up again. But what happened was there was at least one, other complaints to the city clerk's office about political signs near polling places and on city property. City clerk's office had an initial contact with both the Attorney General's office and the Secretary of State's office. There's some conflict between those two offices about what the underlying statutes require or don't require. As I told you before, I then had conversation directly with the Attorney General's office and the relatively new Assistant Attorney General who is now in charge of the election rules. I've been here 8 years now, and in the 8 years that I have been here, there have been 4 individuals filling that position. Generally, and this is no reflection on this particular individual. I don't know him very well, but they tend to not have a lot of experience. So we get little different opinions periodically, and that's what happened this time. The city clerk's office was inclined to bring this issue back again before the city council and to have a resolution with respect to political signs on the property. So we presented that to you. I know that the mayor and others had some concern about whether or not there was enough public conversation with respect to that. So that's one of the reasons that it has come back to you. And quite frankly, in the meantime, I've also had a contact from the ACLU with respect to this question. And this is a matter that I think the board or this committee has heard me talk about before and is still trying to work its way through our country, as a matter of fact. It's the underlying Reed versus the town of Gilbert case. You have heard me talk about that before. The sleeper case that came out a year ago last summer that, for all intents and purposes, fundamentally changed the way the courts look at First Amendment law. Everybody's still trying to get used to that. I raised this question with the Attorney General's office when I spoke with them on the phone. At that point, the Attorney General assistant that I had talked to wasn't familiar with the case, which I was a little bit surprised about, and suggested that they go read that. But at this point, the underlying problem with this particular resolution, and in all resolutions or ordinances enacted by municipalities anywhere in the United States, if it makes a distinction based upon the content of the sign, then technically under Reed versus the town of Gilbert, it's not constitutional to do that. So there is a question now, a fundamental question, as to whether the statutes that underlie this particular resolution and underlie the placement of political signs anywhere, for that matter, is constitutional. Having said all that, and given the pendency of the election, and the fact that the election laws really do speak more directly to the placement of electioneering materials at the polling places on election day, which is what the city clerk is mostly concerned about. Frankly, our recommendation to you at this point is that you just vote to recommend that this thing be voted down at this point until such time as all of these other questions can be resolved. I suspect that after the election, there's going to be more discussion both at the state level with respect to this issue at this point.
Yeah, and kind of to your point that somebody changes every 2 years, I'm like, my first thought is 2 years from now, if we pass this, are they going to come back and say, we get a new person and, yeah, we don't want it?
That could be, or 2 years from now, the underlying statutes that apply to this particular resolution are no longer in effect.
All righty. Questions from the committee? Anyone from the public? Please. You have to sit here and give your name and address, please, to the minute taker.
My name's John F. DiBernardo. I'm a resident and have been since 1951 of Cobb Street in Keene. I've seen some campaigns come and go, and I've certainly seen a lot of signs. Put a lot of them out myself, have for this election. And when I travel through the city of Keene and the outlying towns, it's about as far as I go, I look at the signs, hundreds, thousands perhaps, and I honestly, genuinely think, what a country. We are invested in this government that we have and in this experiment in self-government where we elect our leaders, unlike probably half the people in the world who don't put up with campaign signs because they don't experience campaigns because they don't have elections. Or if they do, there's only one name to vote for, and you'd better put a check beside it or the police will be at your house that night. And I mean this. I genuinely mean this. I look and I think this is wonderful. We are invested in this. We are Americans. We do things. We do things wholeheartedly and completely, or we don't do them at all. We're having elections. We're choosing the people that are going to lead us from the top offices all the way down to the state level at this point. And we want to express our opinions. Now, some of us have access to radio or television or electronic media or print. Many of us don't, and we may wish to publicly declare what we think, and it may take a trip down to the campaign office, pick up a sign or a dozen, and go put them out someplace where our opinions can be seen by the public. Not just the eighth of an acre piece of land on a little side street in the front yard, but out there on that property that is city property, which means it's my property. I own, along with everybody else in the city of Keene, I am an owner of all of the public property in the city of Keene as a resident. It belongs to me. And it's our city government administers it, makes sure nothing happens to it, makes sure it's not hurt, damaged, ruined. And the placement of signs out there for a couple months, every 4 years, and to a lesser degree, every couple years, could be seen by some people as a terrible thing that they have to put up with. But for me, it is a wonderful example of how we have taken to heart this system that we got and want to express our opinions. And so for that reason, I hope that you would vote to not support this ordinance. And that's what I think of as the moral aspect of it, as brought up, is the legal aspect of it and regulating content-based signage. To say, well, if we pass this, we may land up in court, or if we pass this and it's okay now, it may not be a couple of years from now, and we may be challenged. What if you didn't pass it at all and didn't seek to regulate political speech by regulating the placement of signs out there? Or you could say, let's just ban all the signs and have it done with. And you would ban the yard sale signs, you would ban the craft fair signs, you'd ban the charitable organization signs, the fraternal organization signs, you would ban the big United Way sign down at the intersection of Main and Marlborough Street that goes up every year. You'd ban all of the signs. And from that political content point of view and the fact that the First Amendment in the Supreme Court has ruled content-based control would be unconstitutional, I just would state that when the First Amendment to the Constitution was adopted in the mention of free speech to guarantee the insurance of free speech, it wasn't put in there for yard sales and church suppers. It was specifically written to make sure that political speech would never be curtailed. And I think this would be an infringement on political speech, the use of Keene's public property by its residents. So from that legal perspective and the moral perspective, I'd urge you to vote against the adoption of this ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Oh, we'll get one more in them. Name and address for the minute taker, please.
My name is John Thurialt. I live at 76 Bradford Road in Keene. I'm here today as both a private citizen of Keene and also the chairman of the Keene City Republican Committee. So I'm representing the Republicans in Keene as well. I have 2 points, one of which has been mentioned, which is putting signs up is political speech. And John DiBernardo talked about the U.S. Constitution. The city attorney talked about recent legal cases with respect to free speech. But I also like to point to you Article 22 of the New Hampshire Constitution, which says free speech and liberty of the press are essential to the security and freedom of the state. They ought therefore to be inviolably preserved. That doesn't mean you can put this limit on it or that limit on it and this other limit on it. Inviolably means it's inviolate. You can't put anything on it. So that's first point. it's freedom of speech, and city council really would be challenged in court by either the ACLU or one or both of the major parties in the United States if it were to be, if political speech were to be infringed in Keene. The second item is every 4 years we have what's called the First in the Nation primary here in New Hampshire, where candidates for both parties' political offices come here again and again and again. Some of the candidates, Republican candidates, came to Keene 12 or 13 times before First in the Nation primary in February this year. That's an incredible amount of exposure for New Hampshire and also economic activity that occurs in New Hampshire because of it, whether it's advertising or newspaper or rental of facilities like the Historical Society for town hall meetings. It's an incredible amount of economic activity. And if New Hampshire starts being negative or hindering free political speech, it makes our job to preserve that First in the Nation primary, because other states would like to have that exposure, harder and harder. So I think this is a bad idea on freedom of speech basis. It's also a bad idea because it would hurt us in defending our First in the Nation primary status with both political parties. So I urge you to vote down this particular provision and let's stop talking about curtailing political speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a second, Bob. Court, you had something to throw in there?
Okay. Good evening, Mr. Chairman and Committee. Court Blomquist, Public Works Director. I'm going to reflect off of you. Part of certainly the responsibility is for safety under a number of other different statutes. The city, the community is responsible for maintaining safety within our public ways. Just so you're aware, as part of the resolution was a listing of spaces within the public way that we had, and that came from my office about where we currently do regulate and remove signs, not just political signs, but basically any signs. For example, like the medians on Winchester Street, the middle of the roundabout, because technically those are designed not to have people go out into them. It's a safety issue. So what we're doing currently, and we have been doing, and it's been going on since I've been here, is certainly we evaluate those situations of which are a safety concern. And I think someone asked, I think one of the councilors asked me about, well, where are those? And I think the resolution sort of covers those spaces we keep an eye on. The medians, again, that's that 2 to 4 foot space in the middle of the street with cars passing by each fourth on Main Street and Winchester Street, out on Ashbrook Road, etc. We do not recommend, and neither do we want to encourage people to go out into those spaces because they are placing themselves at risk, and also the motoring public, those who are doing it. Again, the center of the roundabouts, those are not designed to have people cross. You see no crosswalks going into the center of the roundabouts. So we are currently, and will continue, I think, at this point, unless, again, direction through the manager's office is, continue to look at these things in a safety standpoint. We do look at it, not just that. I took down some signs for one of our local, I think it was one of the cancer runs off of the Court Street roundabout the other day. We pulled them in, so I know I'm terrible. I know this. I'm getting the looks going, God, Court, you're terrible. But I guess I'm an equal opportunity terrible person. So we also respond to those concerns about intersections. And there are times that can become overcrowded. Again, back to visuals, abilities, and containment. So I just want to make sure the council is aware that we are evaluating some spaces on safety issues. We do recommend that we continue to monitor those safety areas, so that we are not putting people at risk. And that can happen. I mean, this is those things where once one sign goes out, then the next person wants to put theirs, the next person wants to put theirs. And again, we start seeing a number of people going out into those spaces. So I just want the committee and ultimately the council and the public to be aware we are also looking at, from our perspective, from a safety standpoint.
Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, a question for Mr. Theriault. You ran for city council.
I did.
In the last election. And did you know all the people who voted for you?
No.
Did you have signs?
Yes.
Did you place any of those signs in any of the places where they're looking to restrict, such as splitter islands or surrounding roundabouts or near intersections?
Yeah, since I ran at large, literally I placed signs all over the city of Keene, on my own property, of course, but all the rest of the signs, probably over 90 signs were placed along the public right-of-ways in the city of Keene. roundabouts included.
And did you place any signs near any of the voting areas near the,
Yeah, I think I placed one sign near the sort of where the traffic entrance would be at each of the 5 polling locations. And then I had people holding signs at a couple of the polling locations during voting hours. But those were, 50 feet away from the entrance to the polling location per state requirements.
And this is the first time you run for public office?
Yes.
And do you think that name recognition is important in this town?
Oh, absolutely.
And do you think your signs were effective in increasing your name recognition?
Well, I think they increased my name recognition, but I could have used 5 more votes in the primary.
I think I've got all the questions the answers that I need. Thank you.
Anyone else from the public? From Bettina, please.
Yeah, I just have a question for the city attorney. When I was looking this over, it looked like through state statute there was something that already existed regarding polling stations, and I just want to be clear, in my understanding. It sounds like there's a limited area where signs can be, and they have to be handheld, and they can only be on election day. Is that correct? Because if that's true, then we've always been doing it a different way than the state statute anyways, right? I mean, we put them all over the place and days before the elections.
Well, let's be clear, a couple of things. It's a narrower discussion than that. Just that. I'm not really prepared to get into a general discussion about what all the election laws require. But the answer to your specific question is that at the polling locations on Election Day, state statute, which would still apply, does have restrictions with respect to what's otherwise known as electioneering, and that would include placards and signs and people holding signs. And as was mentioned, there is it's a 10-foot wide corridor from the parking area right up into the building where you can't have any of that. Moderators have the right under state law to, it was referenced 50 feet, but that's not always the case. The moderator has rights with respect to where in front of the door people can be and that sort of thing. The larger question that we're dealing with, and there are a couple of comments I want to make with respect to what the gentleman said, only because I kind of got swept into part of his discussion. I don't want this committee, the city council, or the public at large to think that I am suggesting, as was suggested, that there are no limits on First Amendment issues, either under federal law or under state law. That's very clear. It's not an absolute right, and the courts have made that pretty clear. Actually, there are very few absolute rights in our Bill of Rights. So I want to be clear about that. That's not what's being suggested. The problem with this particular resolution at this point, and to the city, the Public Works Director's comments, it's also very clear that the city has rights with respect to public health, safety, and welfare. And to the extent that any sign, and that was what the director was saying, any sign interferes with the public's safety, then the municipality has the right to remove it. The problem with this particular resolution and the statutes that underpin it is it carves out this particular area called political advertising. And that is now problematic under the Supreme Court's interpretation of the First Amendment. So what this, even by denying or, voting to not recommend proceeding with this resolution, you are not changing some of the underlying responsibility that the municipality has in protecting public health, safety, and welfare, and that would include the power to remove signs from roundabouts and from places where the public are not supposed to be. With all due respect to the comment about placing the sign into the roundabouts in areas where pedestrians do not otherwise have access, I'm fairly confident that the court would uphold that. That's also true in things like, we've had this discussion with respect to panhandling and that sort of thing. If you're walking down the street, you can ask somebody for money. You can't cross the highway and stand in the median and put out your hand looking for money because you're not being prohibited from doing that because of your speech issues. You're being prohibited from doing that because of the safety issues. It's different. So in this particular context, the now short answer to your question is none of this changes the underlying issues with respect to electioneering at the polling place on Election Day, including the placement of signs.
Thank you.
Further questions or comments? George, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, am I to understand that we don't need any further resolutions or anything to remove any signs for the public safety element of this? It's already in place. We don't need to do anything
Under the
else with it.
statute, that exists in the statute. That's correct.
Okay. Well, I would just comment that, I've really soured on this particular ordinance, so I would be, I thank the public for coming to speak. I think their opinions and the points they made were very well taken. I heard similar ones from several other individuals that aren't here. I'm happy that this came back to the committee so we could get this information and get this input. And I would support not recommending this resolution be adopted.
Do we still have to do the same backwards motion?
You can do that backwards motion. I would like to make one more comment, though, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind. In contemplating this really is a classic example of a municipality within the state of New Hampshire, not just this one, being placed between the proverbial rock and the hard place. Because we have, as I indicated before, to be responsive to the state agencies that supervise us, including the Attorney General's office. And this whole thing resulted from a conversation that happened with the Attorney General's office. So we were trying to comply with what it is that they're asking us. But I think at this point, and back to Councilor Hansel's position, at this point, I'm much more comfortable letting those agencies and other entities in the state try and fight this battle without us having to be in the middle of it.
Bob?
I'm just curious, and maybe you can't speak to this, maybe Patty would better speak to this, but I'm just trying to figure out, other than the change of the Attorney General, what changed here? What was the problem that we could not deal with before that suddenly we need to change this because one or maybe two people complained? In the past, if there was a sign that was considered to be unsafe to people, then it, as you were saying, it was pulled. So why do we need to have an ordinance about this? If somebody has a complaint because their sign was pulled from an area that was unsafe, that was deemed unsafe, then they could file a complaint and go get their sign back from Public Works and put it in an appropriate area. But I don't know that we actually need an ordinance to address things because everything seemed to be fine beforehand.
Well, Council, let me address your first question, which was what changed. There is a statute, and the very first sentence of the statute is subject to interpretation. And that interpretation is whether or not the municipality, any municipality in the state of New Hampshire, is an owner of property with respect to the obligation to either permit or deny the use of political signs. That's what the statute says. The interpretation on that previously was that owner did not apply to the municipality. Even at that point, I took some exception to that because the municipality can clearly be the owner of property. The municipality has rights with respect to that property just like any other property owner. However, back in 2008, that was the interpretation of the then sitting assistant attorney general, so we went with that. The new interpretation, as a result of the recent phone conversations that happened, resulted in this. And the suggestion, because they don't give us legal advice, even though we are a political subdivision of the state, the suggestion was that the city should enact this kind of resolution with respect to the placement of these signs on city-owned property, which includes rights-of-way. But the problem at that point, as we have just finished discussing, is the change in First Amendment law, which now opens all of that up to question. So the short answer to what you're suggesting is, at this point, I agree with you that we shouldn't be adopting this resolution and that we should rely on the public health safety issues that are associated with the placement of signs and the other statutory responsibilities with respect to electioneering at a polling place.
Thank you. Please.
Oh, I'm really glad it came back, too, and I'm sorry I missed it the first time around, because once it had come to this committee, there was a lot of discussion in the public. John DiBernardo's radio show, people were talking about that, and Danny Mitchell's, and a little bit in the newspaper. And And I really was thinking it would be nice for the public to weigh in, and somehow they felt left out of the loop. So I'm really glad that a couple of you showed up to speak to it. And I think there's certainly, let alone everything else, just the conflict and the messiness of passing something that would contradict state statute, or there could be a clash, or it could change. I mean, it's almost like the ban the bag issue. But so anyways, I'm in favor of voting it down.
Well, that's great, because you get to make the motion.
All righty.
So any thought on verbiage there, Mr. City?
My suggestion would be that the motion would be to recommend to the City Council not to adopt Resolution R 2016-31.
So moved.
Second.
Got off cheap. Further comments or questions from the audience? Any further comments or questions from the committee?
I have a question.
Sure.
Is it possible that this could still get passed at the city council?
Sure.
Of course.
Anything
This
that's
is only a
passed?
recommendation from the committee.
Yeah, well, the rule is simple. We're just an advisory committee like the other three committees. It's always up to the full city council to make the
possible-
final decision.
Is it possible to make no recommendation to kill it right here?
We just made a recommendation to kill it. That's all we can do. We can't make it go away. It still has to go to council for a full vote. Remember, we are always just an advisory board to the full city council. All three committees, MSFI, FOP. Even if we accepted it as informational, it still could be brought up on council and then voted on.
Okay, thank you.
You got it. All right, any further discussion? There being none, all in favor? 5-0.